Hi, I'm Ted Haftegabber, founder and producer of Live Talks Los Angeles. Thanks for joining us. Since we started over a decade ago, we have brought you hundreds of conversations with storytellers, writers, actors, musicians, humorists, chefs, and thought leaders in business and science. You can watch and hear most of these in our YouTube channel and our podcast. For details, visit livetalksla.org. And now, here's the show you've tuned in to see.
Good to see you, Frank.
I feel like Sonny and Cher. I'm not sure which one I am, but Milken is to finance what Einstein was to relativity. Sinatra was to music. Ali was to boxing. No first name is required because we all know the subject. And other than putting someone on the moon, there has never been a human challenge greater in my lifetime than the effort to cure cancer. And no one has done more to push that to a favorable conclusion than Mike Milken. This morning, I woke up in Paris as we were talking backstage. Sounds like the drums of Paris right now. I used up, this is a true story. It is so expensive. I used up 4 decades of points to stay in a room that overlooked the Eiffel Tower. This is the first time ever. He's a very special guy to me. And we'll get into that. But I do not want to be here.
Frank, I haven't used my points in about 8 years, so maybe I could give you a few, okay?
Would you sign that for me, please? I want to be clear about this. You're literally the only person on earth that I would have left Paris for, and I mean that. Your impact, your engagement in the toughest problems over my lifetime. I'm probably alive because of something you did with Faster Cures. I probably have the ability to purchase something because of your involvement in finance. I probably get a chance to teach because of your efforts on education. So I'm grateful. So for the next 90 minutes, I'm going to try to be Charlie Rose without the bathrobe. Actually, or with the bathrobe. I'm not sure which it is, with or without, but anyway. When I was a kid, there was a very famous ad campaign for an advisory firm, and I'm sure you know of it. One guy says, my broker says you should invest in agriculture. Another guy says, my broker thinks that we should be investing in technology. And the third guy says, well, my broker's E.F. Hutton. And E.F. Hutton says, and you get this pause, who's that person to you? We all listen to everything that you say. Who's the person that you listen to?
Well, I listen to my wife, Lori. That's at the top of the list here.
By the way, this is going to be live streamed, so he's now going to have a very good evening when he goes home.
In the early 1960s and mid-60s, I had read a paper by Gary Becker, a professor at the time. He later won a Nobel Prize. And it was after the Watts riots here in Los Angeles in 1965. And I had met a young African-American man a day or two later who was sitting there looking at the building that he worked in that burned down. He was married, he had a child, he had no savings. And he told me that his father wouldn't have access to capital because of the color of his skin, nor would he. So he didn't burn it down himself, but he watched it. And I was thinking to myself, how irrational was this? When he woke up in the morning, he had no job. And Gary Becker had written this paper on why irrational behavior could be rational. So if you said to me, when Gary was alive and we formed this partnership and friendship until he died in 2014, I would think about how Gary approached stuff, or I would talk to Gary about it. But it wasn't about a specific issue. It was more on people, how they think, what motivates them, where the world is going. And I think that's why my very first speech on Wall Street was why the best investor was a social scientist. When do you see the changes coming? Do you see them after they've occurred, or do you see them before? Do you identify a problem before it's a pandemic, or are you dealing with it after it occurs? Do you diagnose a disease after it's spread, or can you identify it when it's easily controllable? So I think that's one of the things that I learned from Gary. And so I would say Gary Becker after Lori.
So you see things that nobody else sees. And you're asking of those rhetorical questions. You actually get answers for them. There was a time when I knew that you used to call around to CEOs, very important people, and I knew you had a series of questions. I would occasionally hear you. What should we be asking our circle of friends to make us see things the way that you see them?
I think the thing that has really struck me here, Frank, is, and I've talked about it in the last couple of weeks, there was a book written a number of years ago that it's different this time. And it was written by a man named Rogoff and a co-author. And what he was writing about was the developing emerging countries were about to default again. And it was during the financial crisis, and his point was it's not going to be different this time. It's going to be the same. And so I think what I see that people don't see today is that it is going to be different this time for the following reason. There are countries all over the world that will be in financial trouble here. There's more than 15 that are in default right now. But what's different this time is the population of children and expansion in the world is in the southern hemisphere, not the northern hemisphere. And the northern hemisphere has dominated for so long. At one point, the United States, Europe, and Japan had 80% of the world's economy with 20% of the population. Today, far less than 50. And so what's different this time is where the young people in the world live is in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts that are about to undergo serious financial challenges. But this is where the world's population is expanding. And I don't really feel people fully understand the dramatic change that's occurring in the world today and people making decisions. If you went to Japan today, you can buy a nice house for $10,000 or $25,000 in the suburbs. Why? Because it might have been a town of 1,000 people and 20 are left. And the young people want to live in the cities. So you just can't have 250,000 more people die every year than are born. And Japan gives you a look at the future. There was a series of articles this last weekend about Korea. The birth rate is 0.79, the lowest ever recorded in the world. And they have parts in Korea now, when you go on vacation or travel restaurants, that say no children allowed. And so I just don't think people fully understand. The U.S. population's 100% higher, but the number of children born is 10% less. And so the children are disappearing in many cases from the northern hemisphere, not counting Pakistan or India at the moment. And I don't think people realize what's about to occur. China finally admitted that more people died than were born. But in 2022, there were less than 10 million children born in China. There was 12 million a few years ago, then it went to 11, then it went to 10, now it's in the 9s. Well, if I take 10 million and multiply it by 75, it's 750 million people, and there's 1.4 billion living in China. What's going to happen if 20 or 30 or 40% of your population disappears? And I don't think people running businesses today or government leaders have fully thought about what's occurring in demographics. So that would be one area that I would focus on. We can get into medical also.
And we will get into medical. There's something that you wrote, and I've seen people do this, and I want to have your voice say this. It's on page 57 of the book. I saw most of you are holding it. If you can just read those 2 paragraphs. And I want to explain.
Frank, you marked in this book.
Okay, I'll buy it. I'll autograph a copy to you. I really believe that he has the solution. I really do. As we'll get into it in this conversation, he's an optimist and I'm a pessimist. But what he's about to read is going to describe why he's different and why we should pay attention to everything that Mike Milken says, if you could.
Do you pay attention when I tell you to eat healthy?
No.
Okay, just,
No.
all right, just checking.
By the way, anyone who wants to go, I'm buying pizza when this is over.
This is the 1960s. Some of my Berkeley friends had joined the Peace Corps, entered law school, worked on Capitol Hill, or followed any of a dozen other worthy pursuits that might contribute to social progress. I had determined that the financial community could also affect change. After all, it was the gatekeeper of investment capital that allowed businesses to create jobs, and it seemed to me the gate wasn't wide open enough. My professors in graduate school soon learned that I was very serious about capital access. Just as I had challenged my parents' bridge party guests when I was 8 years old, as well as my high school and undergrad teachers, I was now asking tough questions about finance. Years later, one of my favorite Wharton professors, Morris Mendelsohn, paid me a compliment by saying that I improved teaching because the professors had to be especially well prepared if I was in their class.
Love that. Is our government serious about the threats and challenges that we are facing?
I'm sure they're serious, Frank. I think the question is being reelected overpower everything else? And so that, to me, is the challenge. Every 2 years in the House, every 4 years for president, I think that is a serious question. If you believe in something, many years ago, I was in the Russian embassy with Gorbachev. And there was a senator who had spent most of his career working on reducing the nuclear threat. And I invited him to join me in the Russian embassy in the late 1980s and discuss this with Gorbachev. And so this was a good part of his life's work, but he told me he couldn't do it because there was a very important campaign issue he had to address. And so I was thinking, and we're now talking 35 years ago, here are your life's work. You've never met the head of the Soviet Union, and here you're going to go to some campaign event because it's taken precedent over your life's work. And so I think in a lot of ways today, that there's a challenge of being reelected in a world we live in today, where you might know the right decision, but you might not be able to make the right decision today. So I think that there's much more agreement than we would think. I know you're concerned about that, Frank, but the media and the world we live in today doesn't allow them the freedom necessarily to do what's right.
I know you have a good relationship with the Emiratis and with Singapore. These are countries that are not democracies, but they're very successful. Rwanda is probably the safest and most developed country in Africa. 30 years ago, they're killing each other in the genocide. This is a really tough question to ask, and I'm hoping that this is the right audience to ask it in front of. And it's if I can get it right, they aren't democracies, but they are a success, and their people are benefiting from it, and it's transferring throughout the whole country. They're being educated, but they're not tearing each other apart. Is it possible that democracy, from what you've seen in business globally, is not necessarily the best form of government all the time?
Well,
did I ask it okay?
I think, Frank, to quote others, I think it is the best form, but obviously a benevolent dictatorship is very effective. And so Singapore was a democracy. The same person was voted in, the same party. But the leader, Lee Kuan Yew, believed that the country was his children and what was best for the country. And what he did, and I visited him in the mid-1970s, what he did different than anyone else is that he educated his own citizens to the level of expats. So his own citizens weren't second-class citizens. He went out and recruited the best and brightest from the entire world to come to Singapore. But he made sure that the citizens of Singapore were educated. And I was in a meeting with, his title now is President of the UAE. And I was sitting there in a meeting with him, and they take great pride in the schools. And someone had mentioned to him that some of the public schools weren't doing that well. His response is, then maybe every one of his grandchildren needs to go to the public schools, not the private schools, so that every one of his children and every one of his brothers and sisters' children would be more concerned about the public schools. A very unusual statement, and I personally have enormous respect for him as a leader. So he has unlimited financial resources today, but he is an extremely caring individual, not just about his own citizens, but others. So yes, but those are two different forms of government. I think the question is today, what we see in the world is, you might say a benevolent leader can put on the most effective, but how long are they benevolent for? Castro came to power as a revolutionary, and unfortunately now for 60, 70 years, the people living in Cuba have paid the price. In Zimbabwe, you had a revolutionary leader that over the decades wanted to remain in power and just almost destroyed his entire country. So that issue is, there's no guarantee that the leader will be benevolent. So in the end of you have to have a democracy in order to protect yourself against that power potentially corrupts.
And one more generic question, then we're going to get to the book. The press has not always treated you kindly. And it has not always, I know that's the understatement of the year. By the way, I can tell we're people who know you. I can tell where they're sitting based on these outbursts of breathless commentary. Why did they not get it? You were engaged in this social justice effort as a young person. You started teaching kids math at what age?
10.
That's incredible.
It didn't always work, you know. I think I might have written about it in the book. You know, when I went to school, to what's now would be called middle school. But I went to a 6-year school, the only one in the city. And I was a 7th grader at the time when I went there. I was 11 years old. And the seniors had a tendency to put boys upside down in the trash can if you were a 7th grader. They were a lot bigger. Or they first scrubbed you with lipstick and then put you in. And so...
Did this happen to you?
Of course. Now...
Is there a photograph of this?
No, but before they did it, I want you to know I offered to do their math homework, okay, help them with their science, etc. That negotiation didn't work. It was more effective in elementary school. But I think anyone that changes the world or changes a system, in the case of finance, there was maybe 15 million non-investment grade companies and 500 investment grade. They had a nice world to themselves. The other people didn't have access to capital. And now all of a sudden, they had to compete. You changed the whole system on them. And if you look at the last 30 years of the 20th century, more than 60 million jobs are created by small and medium businesses that grew, and -4 by big. So it's understandable that AT&T didn't want anyone to give money to MCI, or if Craig McCaw wanted to go into mobile or cellular unless someone gave him money, he couldn't have done it. So I would just say, if I wanted to make an analogy, Frank, it wasn't the media. But at one of our scientific retreats, and I wrote about it in the book, I invited 2 young scientists from Australia to come to our scientific retreat. And they were speaking about ulcers. And everything that everyone said about ulcers was wrong. It wasn't aggravation, it wasn't this, it was bacteria. I'm in the back of the room with 2 of our most esteemed scientists, and they say to each other, "Who are those yobos?" Okay, kind of a derogatory term in Australia. They didn't even go to a good school. And 4 years later, they both won the Nobel Prize. So my comment to you is, if you were in control of the world, and now you had lost control, obviously, if you could get rid of this one person, then maybe the world would be better for you. But it was a dramatic change that occurred, and I would compare it to England when the nobility couldn't compete with the mercantile class. So what did they do? They went to the king and said, "We need to create some new rules here, okay? Because it's not fair what they're accomplishing." But it was an entire change that you were now financing the future, you were financing people with ability, you were giving people access to capital to make their ideas come true, and I assure you, it was extremely frustrating. Have you ever played bridge? Let's go. Have you ever played chess with a good friend?
Of course.
Okay. So when you play chess, what happens? You can't blame it on the weather. You can't blame it on a lucky bounce, okay? Or a bad call by the referee. Someone has defeated you intellectually. Lori and I only played chess once. And we're married 55 years today. So what I'm saying is, if you've lost, all these new financial structures were being created. If you didn't understand that technology, you were at an enormous disadvantage. Today, if you don't understand DNA and sequencing, and you're going to be a clinician, a scientist, you're at an enormous disadvantage today. And so, to me, the status quo has enormous power in the media. And anyone that challenges the status quo, whether it was to talk about ulcers or whatever, is first challenged. And I think, but in the long run, in my opinion, the truth wins out. These two young men won a Nobel Prize.
Do you think that they understand either finance or medicine or research or education? The critics in some of the largest newspapers, do they get it, or are they just getting even?
Well, let's take, you went into 3 areas. In finance today, it is substantially more sophisticated than it was in the 1960s when I went to Wall Street. You have people that are math majors and understand things. You have models. And so when people say things today, they're challenged. We had the head of the Federal Reserve, Volcker, who said no country ever goes bankrupt. Okay? And he encouraged the banking system, and you did not, if I loaned money to Zambia, I didn't have to have any reserves. No reserves for loaning money to a country. If I loaned money to IBM, you had reserves. Well, you almost bankrupted the entire financial system in the 80s. No one questioned it. Today, everyone understands that what has been the worst credit in history are sovereign countries. Zambia just made a deal where they're going to pay you 1% till 2037 under certain conditions. So you can't say what you could have said in the 80s or the 70s or the 60s today. So I would say that is more sophisticated.
So who, if I want information and I want it to be accurate and I want to be able to trust it, where do I go? I can call you up. If you pay me enough money, I'll give you his phone number. But they can't. Where are they going to go to get information to make wise decisions?
I wrote a letter last April in 2022. And I sent it to everyone that manages money for our foundations and a lot of people that work for me. And I told them their greatest risk are their own employees. They've never seen interest rates go up. And all the advice they're giving people might be wrong. And the decisions they're making for their company might be wrong because they've never experienced. Many of your financial firms, more than 50% of their employees are in their 20s. They've never experienced what was happening in financial markets. So to me, Frank, you want to look for someone that has had at least some experience in these issues. Obviously, the internet and AI provides you a lot of information today. But I think financial markets are much more sophisticated. The people making investment decisions are more sophisticated today than they were. And, there's dozens and dozens of firms led or founded by people that work for me. They already got their finance PhD. If I'm talking about education, it's a very difficult thing. We've been funding education for 4 to 5 decades here. If you were a person from outer space with a tricard and you didn't know anything and we're now just reading, you see less children, substantially more employees in the educational system getting paid more, and the results going down. So you understand there must be some problem here. And most people would agree that there needs to be some significant change. And when I travel the world, I often go into elementary schools, early child care centers, because you can see the future of their country by looking at the students.
And what do you see about the future? I'm not going to let this go. What do you see about the future of America based on how we treat and educate our students?
I'd say we have a challenge. And
Is that really the word you want to use?
yes, we have a challenge. But, you know, the first way to solve a challenge or a problem is to recognize you have one. And there are many things we might be able to do. If we had a year of public service or 2 years of public service, all those kids that might not have received education or something would have that chance. We're not necessarily talking about military service. We would also bring rich kids and poor kids together in the same environment. If you look at Singapore, you have mandatory service for up to 4 years in Singapore. If you go to Israel, every single person, man and women, go into the military service. So it's possible that we will at some point have to figure out some sense of public service so you can learn a little bit about history and democracy. I think I told you a number of years ago on this educational quizzes when we asked people, is the United States in North America or South America? Number one answer was South America. And I would say to you, I convinced Barbara Walters to do a special on education, and they did one. It was her lowest rated special that she had. She'd thank me for that. But they asked the kids, who are the heroes of Greece? Greece. Number one answer, John Travolta. Number two, Olivia Newton-John. So there are challenges. And
what about you? Your foundation gave away and gives away significant payments to some of the greatest teachers in the country. You have always celebrated great teaching. Are a majority of our young people being taught by people worthy of their education, worthy of this country's future?
There are many challenges. I would say to you, the great challenge to America was the emancipation of women. And the country never really fully understood what was happening. And in the 1960s, I went to work as a consultant for what is now called Deloitte. And the most talented person I had interacted with was a woman who wrote the code for the IRS and other types of things. And I asked the managing partner at the time when I was leaving Neil Bursch, I told him, you know, Neil, the most talented person you have working for your firm is this woman, and she's a manager. Why is she not a partner? And he looked at me like I was crazy. We don't have any women partners. That was 1960s. And you also quote a significant change of having the pill, etc., and many other, the emancipated. So if I would have told you in 1970 that a woman was the CEO of the largest defense contractor, largest automobile company, and IBM, you would have told me I was crazy. But at one time, there was a woman in charge. So you went from the top 15% of the graduating class to the bottom 15%. And so you...
Say that again, because I want you to hear it, what he really means by this. What was the top 15%?
The top 15% of women, their number one occupation was teacher.
And now who's going to teaching?
It's primarily the bottom 15%. That doesn't
hear
mean
that?
there aren't outstanding, but Singapore made their teachers the most prestigious position you could possibly have. And so it's a challenge. It's a challenge. And, but whether it's a company, whether it's a sports team, whether it's a government, you're only as good as your leaders. And so what we did 4 decades ago is try to figure out how can we upgrade the image of the profession by recognizing excellence in teaching. Who are the best teachers? I think we're up to almost 3,000 now. And my brother, Lowell, has devoted most of the last 30 or 40 years to this effort. But you wanted to create role models for others. But we have to find a way that there's equal opportunity. And sometimes it's just little things. Is there a bathroom? If I'm a teacher, is there a bathroom that I can go to? Do I have any place I can go? What is the working environment like? Etc. So there are a lot of challenges, but the challenge to a country is, do we have an educated workforce? Because people go all over the world looking for that. You know, we announced we're going to create the most advanced chip factories. Well, then we discovered that we don't necessarily have someone in the United States that knows how to do that. We have to go to Taiwan and convince a lot of people from Taiwan to come here to help build those. So education underpins our society. And therefore, if we recognize we have a problem, we have to find a solution to that problem.
And I just would add to it, being somebody who teaches all over the globe, in Africa, the Middle East, the UK, Italy. I'm the only Jew who is taught in the premier Protestant country, Catholic country, Muslim country, in the same time. Our students have so much, and they're grateful for so little. And my African students have so little, and they're grateful for so much. And I see you as a person who can make a difference there. I want to bring you to the book because that's why you're here. I want to make sure that
I'm actually here to see you tonight, Frank. You came all the way from France.
He has yelled at me twice in my life. I've known him now, I've actually looked it up. I've known you for 16 years, but you only started talking to me 13 years ago. I'm the only person who has ever flown private on his plane, and he still wouldn't talk to me. These shoes that I'm wearing right here, and you can probably see them, I was specifically told by Mike, we're meeting the King of Jordan the next day, and Mike said to me, do not wear those. You will embarrass yourself, you will embarrass me, go buy a pair of shoes. The next day I show up in these shoes. He's mad as hell at me. The king walks in, shakes his hand, shakes 2 other people's hands, sees my shoes, asks me, can I see Jordan on those shoes? This shoe has Jordan.
They don't know it has a map of the world on it.
But that, yes, you can take a look when this thing is over. He was so excited that someone actually wore his country on his shoes. This did happen, did it not? He gave me the first question. He talked to me during the entire conversation, and it was very special. The other time he yelled at me, I was meeting with Sandy Koufax, a great pitcher, and I asked him for a photograph. And if any of you have ever met Sandy Koufax, he's a little bit, he gets angry.
Shy.
Yes, shy. So he was annoyed at me, and Mike standing behind him and did not realize what was happening. And Sandy was kind of being a little bit rough on me. And Mike says, what did you do to him to make him upset? So Mike goes up to him 5 minutes later to ask for his photograph, and Koufax treats him worse. So I'm just standing behind Koufax going, you see this? I had to read this, and I was given a galley copy. So I read it the very first day because of what is in it and what it says about you. I'm just curious, why now? You could have written this 5 years ago, 15 years ago. Why did you decide to put pen to paper and make a statement about research, about science, about cancer, about life? Why now?
It was after COVID, And the world changed because of COVID. I changed, everyone that works with me changed, the country changed, how we did research changed. And in a matter of weeks, not decades, not years, the first human being received a vaccine, 63 days after they sequenced it. Computers are a million times faster. We have a tremendous opportunity to eliminate many diseases as a cause of death. And we showed during this period of time how people reacted. I let everyone know, it heads all of our centers and foundations, that we will all be judged. Every one of us will be judged by what we do. If you think shortening it by one day is worth 10,000 lives, 20,000 lives, you're going to try to figure out what you're going to do different. So we did something different. Pharmaceutical companies shut a factory down and manufactured a competitor's product. The U.S. government put up billions of dollars to build factories to make vaccines or antivirals, and we didn't even know if they're going to work. The government put up money to manufacture these products, and we didn't know if they would work. And so the outpouring of support throughout the world, philanthropically coordinating, changed the world. And now, after you think you've solved a problem, my concern is, instead of pushing your foot down on the accelerator, we would move it to the brake.
But let me give you a statistic. 25% of the country thinks these vaccines kill you. We have done such a remarkable job in this country saving lives. It was a miracle they could get this stuff done. And you have somebody running for president, and it's not who you think it is, it's the other guy. So now you have a Democrat. So now we have both, in the Democratic and the Republican Party, people challenging science. Doesn't that keep you awake at night? Doesn't that drive you nuts?
Well, that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book. I'd say the book is a year late. It should have been out a year ago. But I've made this analogy to a number of people. I'm like I Love Lucy, you know, Lucille Ball, with a little chocolate coming down that little line. Okay, and it's okay. Can you stop the conveyor belt so I can go write the book? No. Life and the world's conveyor belt is moving. So you had to write the book. You had to let people understand, what do you really care about at the end of the day? Do you want to have a long, healthy life? If you're in finance or business, public health and medical research is accountable for more than 50% of all economic growth. These advances are such. In the book with Jeff Moore that we did, we pointed out, what is public health? What is a vaccine? You know, for many people, you've taken something, you didn't even give any credit to it because you didn't even know it could have threatened your life. And so we're on the verge of all these unbelievable things happening. And so I had to write the book. If you say to me, Frank, after that young man at Watts, I had to go into finance and give up my dream of running our space program. When I was diagnosed with cancer in '93 and I saw what was going on in the research community, we had to put on a march. We didn't have a choice. They would never increase the budget at the NIH, the National Institutes of Health. We had to put on a march. And 14 years later, we had to re-energize by putting on something called the Celebration of Science. So there are times in history when you want to step forward. To me, I had to write this book to let you know that we have a chance. now to save most people that get diagnosed with a life-threatening disease, if we just stick it out.
And by the way, I want you, I know a lot of the people who are here in this room, and you have influence. The people in this room are in the top 1 or 2% of the country. Do you want to make a statement, or do you want to make a difference? And all throughout your career, you've made a difference. Here's what I don't understand. You're not a doctor. You don't even play one on television. And you've done more to promote medical research, and not treatment, but cures. What is it that got people to pay attention to you, and what can we all do to have the same kind of impact?
I would say it's not that much difference in finance or education. You went out and recruited the best and brightest. I wrote about it, in the book. There were great scientists that were going to do something else. One guy was going to go work on apples. Another guy was going to be dean of the School of Biology at Harvard. And I convinced them to work in this area. So if you want solutions to medical problems, you have to make sure you have the best and brightest working on them. So you have to recruit them. You have to provide capital. I met 2 of our country's greatest young clinician scientists, Jonathan Simons and Bill Nelson at Hopkins, in late February of '93. And one wanted to work in prostate cancer, and they told him it'd be career suicide. I told him he made the best decision of his life, and then I will commit the capital to make sure that was okay. So recruiting people, creating a partnership of teams that share data rather than isolated. I wrote about when I went to MD Anderson, I spoke to the head of the person putting the conference on, Andy von Eschenbach, who later became the head of the NCI and the head of the FDA, when I went there in '93, and I asked him, where was Memorial Sloan Kettering? And he told me, we think Memorial Sloan Kettering is a competitor. Now, if I go back in time, I haven't done the data, but I'm guessing either MD Anderson or Memorial for most of the last 40 years has been a leader. And I told him, not to the patient. They're not to the patient. How can you put on a research conference and not have anyone from Memorial here at this conference? And so there are simple things that we learned in finance, or you learned in education, the best teachers, the best entrepreneurs, and give them capital. And so those elements, the world has changed because of hundreds or thousands of young scientists that went into the field of science and got financial backing and support and were forced to be a team. I mean, I grew up in LA and went to graduate school in Philadelphia. The Lakers had better players. The 76ers had better players, but Boston was a better team. And so in much of our awards in medical, if you team up with 3 or 4 other institutions, you have a higher chance of winning than if you don't, and it's all internal. Andy Grove was on our board, and Andy worked that it was easier for someone at MD Anderson to communicate with someone at Memorial Sloan Kettering than it was on a person on a different floor at MD Anderson. So the technology was laid in to create these teamwork. So it's not that much different. You might want to be a great football team, but if you don't have a good quarterback or somebody who can catch the ball, etc., you might not be a great football team. And if you want to be a great bioscience company, you can't be unless you have some great people on your team. There was a special made called, I think, Science Wins. And it's about Pfizer. during COVID. Now, we did a lot of things. I interviewed the CEO of Pfizer to try to accelerate, and I did a podcast for a year and a half, which was made available to every person on the planet so you could hear what they were thinking about. But he sat down and they invested $2 billion in a product that they didn't know if it would work. They took no government money, but they went through the entire firm and got their best and brightest people to work on it. So there is no surprise, Frank, that if you give capital to people with the best ability and create a team, you're going to succeed. And I would say in business, I told my own firm, gosh, MCI, when I first met them, only had 30 employees, and AT&T, 1.4 million. And let's say there was a lot of pressure. Anyone that loaned money to MCI would be blacklisted. But I told them it wasn't fair. I've been looking at the situation, and I think AT&T needs 2 million employees for Bill McGowan. It's not fair. They only have 1.4 million. They can't compete. And so it's understanding the power of the individual. And I go back to where we started the conversation. Gary Becker. He won a Nobel Prize for the concept of human capital, of people, of their talent. It's the biggest asset. And it's amazing what you can do if you can empower individuals with drive, determination, and ability. And I would say that has been the difference. Yes, we put on a march in '98, and the government doubled the NIH budget in a couple months. Sometimes you need a good strategy. I had looked at the situation, and everyone tried to increase the government's investment in medical research. But there were too many voices. 500 diseases all beating on Congress and the administration. And so we told them all, okay, everyone's going to get a doubling. Diabetes is going to get a doubling, Alzheimer's is going to get a doubling, Parkinson's going to doubling, but let us go forward with cancer because everyone is scared of cancer. And 1 in 2 men get cancer and 1 in 3 women. And if we can get support and people are scared of cancer, when they double the NIH, that'll cover every disease. And so it was too fragmented. It created a laser effect in those areas. But, you know, we're in that challenge today for biotech companies. Again, in November of 21, if you majored in biology, forget majored. If you took a biology course in high school, you could raise money for your biotech companies today. Today, if you have 50 PhDs, you might not be able to raise a dime. So there are times that you need to address. But I think the principles that we used in medicine were the same we use in business or finance or education.
So we are 8 minutes away from you guys being able to ask questions. We're going to have time for that. So you can start preparing it in your head. As you look ahead, and you had some interesting observations in the book about the future, what do you think are the 2 most exciting developments based on what you see right now in science, medicine, and research?
I don't think there's only 2. It's hard to say that.
But if you had to prioritize.
I think ultimately CRISPR technology, it's a little farther out. The idea that I can change your genes. And so many diseases, it's just 1 or 2 genes that cause you to have them. The idea that if we can compare it to a good friend of mine, Dr. Milken, who told me it's spell checked and helped finance the early work in this area. But so you were born and you have a couple words or letters you need to change. And so I think that is enormous potential for change. That's 1. 2, I think just the overall idea of your immune system. the ability to energize your own immune system to deal with your disease and put it into remission is so exciting. I finished that book, Frank, that last chapter, talking about what was maybe 36 hours in my life, which touched all the parts of my life: education, medical research, finance, etc. But I talked about going to what was the melanoma research and the financial world coming together. Leverage finance fights melanoma. My father had died of melanoma, and the CEO of the Melanoma Research Alliance came down with COVID, and I had to be the master of ceremonies in New York. I was in Boston, so I flew there. And I talk about it in the book. There were 3 young men who all had melanoma had spread to their brain, their liver, and their lungs. Normal life expectancy would have been measured in months, not years. All 3 of them were in total remission because of checkpoint inhibitors and work Jim Allison done and that I listened to at a 1997 scientific retreat. We worked for 10 years in prostate cancer. It didn't work, so we shifted to another one of our related medical research groups, which was the Melanoma Research Alliance. So there you saw, for me, the bookend of my life. My father, mother-in-law, all my relatives dying of cancer. And now, 50 years later, people not that just diagnosed with cancer, but cancer had spread and metastasized to their brain, their liver, and their lungs. By just taking these checkpoint inhibitors, we're in total remission. And so it bookended what forced me to focus on medical research 50 plus years before and the benefits of what occurred. So they're leading, all 3 of them, productive lives. I talked about one of them whose mother came to visit with him because she knew he was going to die, and all she did was cry every day. And I think after the 2nd day or 3rd, he told me he had to send her home because he was trying to get well. And with her crying 24 hours a day, it wasn't going to have a positive effect on him. And I would say, Frank, I thought back to, at this time, 30 years ago, when I had visited Dr. DeKernian at UCLA with Lori, and I'd asked him as the head of oncology, urology, what I should do. And after studying that, and Lori and I went to see him for a solution to our problem, his solution was, I should get a good psychiatrist, we should get a psychologist for our children, and I should get my affairs in order. And that was 30 some odd years ago, and I told him I really appreciate all the effort he's put into this here. But I thought I'd try to do something first. So here was myself 30 years before. Here were 3 people. And just seeing them alive and well and vibrant and building families kind of booked in the success and what's in front of us.
Okay.
Really, what is in front of us?
3 more, they're quick, and you can, I think we're going to turn the house lights on. First, your office had given me a list of questions that they thought I should ask you.
Frank, they don't know you as well as I do.
And let's just say that I don't even think I read it, but one of the questions I actually want to turn it, because I saw that there's a couple of young people here. What advice would you give a 20-year-old who's inspired by your career, believes in your mission, and wants to make a meaningful, measurable impact on the world around them? Based on what you've experienced, what should they know or what should they do?
I would say finance today is much more sophisticated than it was when I was an undergrad student at Berkeley and was studying and discussed and discovered that every single thing everyone said about credit was wrong. Today, that's not the case. The potential in medical area and bioscience is so great. First, you have to go into an area that you have passion for, because if you don't, it's not going to work. But today, the potential in bioscience is so significant, and it is not just, and we wrote about it, it's not just your health. It's energy, it's the environment, it's agriculture, unfortunately it's bioterrorism, it's all of those things. And there was a book written a few years ago, As the World Catches You, and basically it said that Western civilization, in this case Europe, moved ahead because it had a 26-letter alphabet, and you could pass knowledge from one generation to another. And then you had zeros and ones in the 20th century in computers. And the language of this century, the 21st century, is the letters of the genome of a plant, the genome of everything. And so, to me, the potential is so great to solve problems that my guess is I wouldn't be thinking about going to space today. I'd be thinking about going into bioscience and how I might deploy it, whether it's in food, agriculture, health, energy, you name it.
Second, and I gotta ask, you've had a tough relationship with Rudy Giuliani. And yet, when he got sick, you called him and helped him. I don't know people like that. I don't know people who can, I don't know whether it's forgiveness or open-mindedness, but I know from talking to him how significant your conversations with him were. How did you do that? And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you need to research it, because this is a great human being here, and he had not been great to you.
His father had died from prostate cancer. Now he had prostate cancer. Potential prognosis was negative. I don't believe revenge is a productive emotion. And I also, you can't go forward if you're stuck in the past. So my view was, I had the ability to help him extend his life, the quality of his life, etc. I was not going to deny him or anyone else that opportunity. Now, I can't tell you everyone agreed with it in my family. But, you know, he later told me, he apologized. He told me, you know, had he known me, it would have been different, etc. But I had to move on, you know, and here, he, because of his family history, had a potential very negative outcome that was going to hit him. So to me, if you have the knowledge and someone's in need, you need to help them. And in this case, it might not have been a person that had caused a lot of aggravation in my life. But I think, unfortunately, people make decisions for a lot of different reasons that have power that maybe later they wouldn't have made the same decisions. And I felt that with him.
Well, you did the same for me a few years ago. I say it in every public forum because I would not be here if you had not intervened. I am a horrible horrible recipient of advice. There's people who know me know, probably worse now than ever before.
I don't think worse. You're still down from your peak. Okay, but you know, it takes discipline. You know, I wrote about, except for the people that won the Nathan's hot dog eating contest, I had eaten more hot dogs than anyone, okay? They opened a shrine at Berkeley when I was a sophomore called Top Dog, and I don't know if anyone has ever gone. It was just a shrine, and I never went to sleep without eating 2 to 12 hot dogs at night. So when you're diagnosed with cancer, you have to make some decisions. And in my case, there was no hot dog worth living for, you know, giving up life for. I would say this, that many people that I've engaged with, Frank, were not willing to change their lifestyle, and unfortunately it did not serve them well. Yes, you had a significant intervention.
He offered to pay me to stop eating. And just for the record, I said no. But there's something in here also where you talk about your favorite restaurant was Bob's Big Boy. I have the original statue. It's about 10 feet tall, about 7 or 8 feet wide, of this guy holding up the hamburger. And I had it brought to LA, and I'm going to deliver it to your house if you want it.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you very much.
So let's do Q&A for a few minutes. Her hand went up first, so we can start with her.
So how did you survive? What did you do? You found out more than the head of oncology at UCLA.
Well, the first thing I stopped doing is I didn't eat anything for 2 years that wasn't raw fruits and vegetables, because I analyzed that all my relatives had died and their prognosis was better than mine, and no one had tried to change their diet or their microbiome. So that's one of the first things I did. And I wrote about, I began a major effort here and focused on what you eat in your nutrition and how it can change your microbiome. Indian medicine, Ayurveda medicine, believes that your gut is your second brain. So everything you eat, everything you drink, everything you do, it has to turn into energy or waste, etc. And if you looked at anecdotal evidence, this is now 93, 94, you would see that countries that were plant-based eating had far less incidence of hormone-driven cancers, breast, prostate, and far less diabetes. Today, you can prove it because you can sequence. You can sequence your microbiome, you can sequence your genome, you can sequence your disease today, and it's now been approved in the last few months that you can give the microbiome of one human being who responded well to treatment to another who did not respond well. So it's reinforced these issues here. And so the other thing I would say I did is most people do the least they can do at the beginning. Whatever's the least they're willing to do. At a reoccurrence later of a life-threatening disease, they're willing to do anything to stay alive. If you do more at the beginning, you have a much better chance of success. Now, this world is changing now with things like Grail and others that have the ability to diagnose life-threatening diseases before you could ever find them. So there is a DNA waste, think of it as released into your blood. And now this one test covers 50 cancers. So it hasn't even metastasized. You couldn't find it. You're not going to see it in a mammogram. It's just some cancer cells floating around in your body. But now you can discover them earlier. But I would say for myself, tremendous change in diet and a willingness to take treatment when they might have said you don't need it at the beginning. Leslie, former head CEO of the Prostate Cancer Foundation and my boss. Yes, Leslie.
If anybody believes that, I've got some mortar to sell you. So you've always been a source of realistic optimism for everybody around you. And I think it's indisputable that these are very challenging times economically, from a climate perspective, politically, socially. When you need to get that little adrenaline pump of a basis for realistic optimism, what do you look at? What do you think about?
I would say I'm constantly looking at the world, Leslie, and trying to understand what the challenges are and then what are the potential solutions. If you'd say to me a year and a half ago, I tried to tell everyone who was responsible for a business to borrow as much money for as long as they could, that the winter was coming. And so you could sense what was going to happen. And people had a chance to put their house in order financially. Today, I've commented, the great change, the great change that's with us is relating to where the children in the world are. So there's a lot of ways to show it to people. I gave a talk the other day just showing maps, but there is substantially more children born in one country, Nigeria, than all of Eastern and Western Europe combined. There are more than twice as many children born in Nigeria as the United States. If we don't provide opportunities for people in Nigeria, they'll be here. The world has really never seen 1 billion people on the move or 2 billion people on the move. And so if I am a mother of 2 kids in Zambia and I'm worried about, am I going to have food? My phone shows me what life's like in Madrid or Marseille or Athens or someplace else. And every day you read about a catastrophe of someone that's trying to cross the Mediterranean into Europe for a better life for their children. And so that's why I mentioned it before. There is such a change going on today, but by making capital available to people, you're going to create opportunities in their country. So I think what fires me up is first understanding what the challenges are. My very first speech on Wall Street in the late 60s was the best investor is a social scientist. And I'm sure over the years you heard enough from me about what's going to happen, etc. And I feel most people, if they really sat down and thought about it, know what's going to happen. You might not know the timing, but you know what's going to happen. And so therefore, you want to direct your energy into preventing a catastrophe from occurring or solving that issue. And that, to me, is energizing. We can reach out and solve that problem. You were there and an architect of separating CapCure, which was the original name, and calling it the Prostate Cancer Foundation, and separating the cures into our other organization, Faster Cures. So it had grown to such a significance that we couldn't have one organization do everything. So what gets me fired up in the morning is just thinking about, okay, what are the challenges we're about to see? And I think Frank's comment to me was to all of us that a percentage of the population was never vaccinated, doesn't believe in it, etc. You know, I wrote about it in the book. My father had polio. He died from cancer. But when you go back and look at polio, after the vaccine was available and approved, that didn't mean everyone took it. And more than a year after it existed, only 0.8%, less than 1% of teenagers had ever been inoculated. So looking around, and what happened? What happened is Elvis Presley was on the Ed Sullivan Show and got the polio vaccine. In less than a year, you went from less than 1% to 80% of all the teenagers in America were vaccinated with the polio vaccine. So I ran around asking everyone in April of 20, where's Elvis? Okay? Who is Elvis today? And as Frank has just told you, we could not find one person that everyone would go get vaccinated if that person told you. And when we were doing positive, every single person was saying, well, if this person told me to get it, I wouldn't get it. And I think it tells you about the country today. The idea that you can go from 0.8 to 80% in a year because one human being got vaccinated, we need to find out who that human being is, and maybe that person should be our next president. I don't know.
There is somebody. I'm going to go back 20 years. So it's not her, because if you're over 50, she's not so great to you. 20 years ago, it's going to freak you out.
Walter Cronkite?
That's 35 years ago.
Okay.
20 years ago, it was Bill Cosby. If you remember, there was a time when he was America's dad. He was a doctor in the show, and he had more influence than anyone. He's been destroyed. After him is Oprah Winfrey. Now she's become political, and she's more divisive. She's still incredibly trusted, but there are people who don't listen.
You also had her tell, as you know, the American public in '87 that 20% of everyone was going to die from AIDS in the next 3 years. I wrote about that. That didn't happen. So, but I, your comment about Bill Cosby, I think the show, I don't even remember how many tens of millions of people watched that show.
And so the most trusted person right now is actually Tom Hanks. And he's in entertainment. I say this here in this community because someone in this room knows him. Someone in this room has the ability to get to him. And the problem is, will they actually do it? Because I don't know another community that is more outspoken about what they don't like and less likely to do what it'll take to change it. And I say this not to be provocative, but there are very few people like you, and we're still going to do 2 or 3 more questions, but there are very few people like you who reach without a partisan, without an ideological statement, that you can discuss science and medicine and finance. And there's no left or right, there's just right or wrong. And we don't have enough of that in this country right now, and that's something we need to be promoting.
Mike, you've been able to see what the future has better than most people. What is your view of the downside of artificial intelligence going forward?
Bob, you and I think, are old enough to remember. I forget I think the movie was Running Man with Arnold Schwarzenegger, where they mapped his face onto someone else who had committed a murder. Sandy Kleiman can correct me on that if that was the wrong movie. Was that the wrong movie or the right movie? Okay. I went to dinner about last October, November with a friend who told me he had write an anniversary love note to his wife. Okay? I told him, probably not a good idea. Okay, she loved the note, but she eventually found out that, the bot wrote the note. I think it's very hard when you have potential misinformation, then be able to do that. I was mentioning to Frank, I was at the Giants game in San Francisco a few weeks ago, and I had spoken for about 10 minutes. I was on the television and the radio, and one of the individuals here today, Ahmad, I didn't see you, Ahmad, recorded my voice and replaced my voice in reading my book online. So is it real? It's so easy today. And I think what scares me the most is for people who constantly get pushed information because they went to a site and now their view of the world has been totally warped. And I'm sure it's not just me, but many people have had their children commit suicide. Bob, an area that you are very knowledgeable on, because the world looked so terrible to them online and was pushed to them online. And so I don't know the solution to the issue right now, but maybe we will find the answer. But for every new power, there's both negatives and positives today.
I got the data behind this. 1/3 of adults know someone who's either been physically or mentally harmed by social media already. Among those 18 to 29, it's over 50%. We did sessions with moms, and they were describing what their kids did if you tried to take away their phones. They would attack them, throw the phone at them, refuse to speak to them at a meal, become completely sullen, cut out. These are not just the symptoms, but this is proof of addiction. And yet we do nothing about it. I don't know.
Frank, at our conference a few months ago, we had some of the leading sociologists in this country do work and present it. And what was so interesting, if you go back 20 or so years, for a young woman, what was the biggest issue? Career versus family. Okay, concern that if they had as successful, would they be sacrificing family issue? And I forget how many years ago it was, let's call it 6 or 7, maybe 8. The number one concern of young women was fame and what other people thought. And you can look at the increase in suicides, which I believe now suicide is the leading cause of death for women at certain ages. And so this is a challenge if what people who you don't even know or do know have to say about you is the most important thing in your life, then there are a lot of challenges in this area. Let's hug our kids.
Actually, and take, who's got kids between the ages of 9 and 18 here? Raise your hands.
I've got grandkids.
I'll do them. Who's got grandkids between that age? Go home tonight and take the phone away. And if you don't do it, I heard the from this corner. By the way, this is the bad corner of the room here. If you won't do it, then you have no one to blame but yourself when your kid gets addicted. Because if you won't do it, who the hell will? So this is what you're the optimist. To respond to you, everything I see makes me upset. Because we see these problems, we see the challenges, and no one does anything. We complain about it, but we don't do anything about it. So I need you're going to have the last question. So you need to be hopeful and positive. It needs to be such a good question, because if it's not, then I'm going to bring the entire room down.
Thank you so much for the great questions that you asked, Frank, and also the deep, inspiring answers that you gave, Michael. And also about the touch points in Singapore, because I've been living there for the last 8 years and still continuing to do so. I got inspired actually to do my biology and finance degrees many years ago because there was a book by Michael Mauboussin talking about more than you know, finding financial wisdom in unconventional places. Some of the things that he touched base on was actually about how you can compare the financial markets, which is the backbone of society, with other fields such as casino gambling or even biology. So he talks about Darwin's survival of the fittest, as well as trying to do the scientific method. So tonight you talked about inspiring the next generations to go into bioscience fields or medical fields. What do you see from the financial fields, aside from providing capital, that we can learn about having people be more into the bioscience or medical fields?
I often go when I speak to classes that have been hired by the financial firms and ask them, how many of you went into finance to change the world? And I would say to you, sadly, very few raised their hand today. But the link of finance, and I just mentioned it to you, is that if bioscience in those countries or states or regions that are a leader in bioscience will be the leader in the world in this century, then who's going to provide the capital? Who's going to understand those individuals with new ideas and things they can bring to bear today? And so, to me, the link, if that's the question, between finance and bioscience is the providing the capital. There are many industries where you don't get the output till long after you invest. If I want to go make a movie, in the old days I had to invest all my money and then I got a return. Today you start selling the rights earlier for that movie. But in the case of bioscience, if I was to just give you one example, in the year 2000, and I think the chart's in the book, this was a point in time that was extremely difficult for biotech companies. Merck was worth 170. Just seeing if there was a slide popping up. Merck was worth $175 billion, and the 180 or so biotech companies combined were worth $150 billion. The biotech companies were spending $8 billion on research, and Merck was spending a couple billion. They were working on 10 times as many things as Merck. But it was difficult at that point in time. 3 years later, just two of those 150 combined were worth more than Merck. So today, with many of the biotech companies off 80 to 90% today, where is the capital coming from keeping them alive today in this period of time? And so is this period of time, 2023, going to create the same opportunities as 2000? And so it will take individuals with enormous foresight and ability to figure out how you're going to finance these new ideas today. In 21, anyone could have done it. Today, you're going to need more talent. So they are linked. If you said to me, what was the hardest industry that I ever financed, it was mobile phones. Nobody believed in mobile telephones. Nobody. AT&T, who invented the technology, decided not to go in the business. And so trying to convince people that the future was this mobile phone, and the phone was where you were, not that you went to a phone, was extremely difficult. It forged close ties and friendships like myself with Craig McCall. But it was easy for him to become a friend because no one else believed in it except us. Today, you know, it's a much different world in mobile, etc. So I think we need to, if you want to link finance and medicine, who are those individuals who are going to bring capital to people in bioscience during difficult times, not during good times?
But they need people who are going to speak up for them. We demonize people with capital now. You all know this. Read the New York Times, Financial Times, LA Times. If you've got capital and you're investing in it, those newspapers come at you and demonize the reason why you do it. That there's so much now that is so negative. I wrote a quote for you because you give me such a hard time. A pessimist thinks things can't get any worse. An optimist knows they can. Tonight is so special, but as much as it is for me, it's special that you all get a chance to hear from Mike in an unedited, unvarnished conversation about the various aspects of his life as someone who's done so much good for so many people. I'm glad that you wrote the book because people need to know this. And I just hope that when you walk out of here, the conversation doesn't stop. That you get your kids tomorrow at breakfast or wake them up and have a conversation about the importance of math, of science, of finance, of taking your education seriously, taking your studies seriously, because you can end up, there's a phrase, call it master the universe, and that's not you. But you've made the universe a better place for every single person in this room. Mike Milken, thank God for you.
Thank you, Frank.